Hello everybody. I thought I'd make this video on social environmental accounting to help you in your studies. Our online meetings aren't working as well as I thought they would or hoped they would. So I thought this might be a better alternative for us as we move through the topics. So make yourself a cup of tea or start the washing up and we'll have a little chat about social environmental accounting. So the learning objectives for this topic are to understand the role of the theory in social environmental accounting research and be aware of various perspectives about the responsibilities of businesses. We really want to know, or really want everybody to know about the theories behind these environmental reporting. So basically, what's going on out there in the business world? What are businesses actually doing in terms of social and environmental reporting, and what are the various accounting theories that might describe why organisations choose to report and what sort of information they choose to report. The point 4 is important. Identify some of the limitations of traditional financial accounting in relation to enabling users of reports to assess a reporting entity's social and environmental performance. And I think it's easy to agree that economic reporting, conventional financial accounting reporting, basically ignores a lot of the social and environmental factors which are important for investors, for other businesses, suppliers, for the environment, for all other stakeholders. So why are businesses here? I think it's safe to assume that the primary business objective is profit, but what are other business objectives? And we'll have a think about that as we progress through. So you would have heard discussion sometime on triple bottom line reporting. So that's reporting that provides information about economic, environmental and social performance of a business. So it represents a departure from a solely numbers focus and is tied to the concept and goal of sustainable development. Now obviously we weren't going to hear about sustainability in the business context before it had been created as a concept in itself. Now the Brundtland report came out in 1987 and it basically put sustainability on the worldwide business agenda. They defined sustainability as development that meets the needs of the present world without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So it came out of a United Nations report. Intergenerational and intragenerational equity is central to the agenda. So it's looking at a very long-term focus when we're thinking about sustainability. We're talking about the triple bottom line. Some people may have seen the graph or the little picture depicting the triple bottom line or similar types of reporting initiatives. There's a stool, a three-legged stool with economic, environmental and social reporting as the three legs of the stool, indicating that if you don't ignore one leg, basically, you fall over. Now, it's hard to talk about sustainability and environmental issues without thinking of these things in a worldwide context and actually considering that a lot of people around the world don't live as well as we do, don't have the basic opportunities that we sort of take for granted. And unless you have those, are you really in a situation where you can actually make decisions about sustainability in the environment? If you're basically focused on these lower level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as we see it here, are you really going to be able to put resources into, think about, even conceptualize some of the things that we talk about with social environmental reporting, which are probably out here? So what are the responsibilities of business? Now we hold that businesses have a responsibility for social environmental performance. So if we're asking them to report on it, it basically means that we think they're responsible for it as well. And lots of companies have started, or have for some time, prepared social and environmental reports. BHP produces a sustainability report. Westpac produced one, Rio Tinto produced one. And you can have a look at those online, and there are three quite interesting examples. Another one I draw your attention to, if you do have some time to do some extra reading or you'd like to participate in some active procrastination, as I like to call it, is Google the New Britain Palm Oil Company, www.nbpol.com.pg. They're a company with some palm oil plantations in Papua New Guinea, and they've produced quite an interesting sustainability report. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So here's a page from Barrick Gold. Barrick used to own a mine quite local to where I live in the West Wyalong area. It's just been taken over by another Australian-based mining company, but Barrick's a Canadian company, and they do quite a bit of reporting on various issues, as you can see here. We've got social issues, their scholarships provided, basically their workplace issues, ethics, injuries, and then sort of more of the conventional environmental issues, water recharge, power, etc. Westpac, focusing more on social issues rather than environmental issues. They look at their social reporting on 3 different bases: healthy relationships with money, prosperous communities, and a future-focused nation. Now, the cynic in me and the cynic in anyone can have a look at these things from a couple of different perspectives, and some of the accounting theories go on to describe them in more detail, but a lot of this is actually a big part of marketing for some businesses and a big part of building future markets. So you can see here with Westpac, healthy relationships with money, prosperous communities, and a future-focused nation. Focusing on those 3 areas definitely has a big, strong marketing element to it, but also potentially long-term increases the prosperity of their business. So how does an entity determine its responsibilities? Well, they look perhaps to their stakeholders initially, and what do the relevant stakeholders consider their responsibilities to be? It's potentially based on the personal judgment of the management involved, which then, I guess, goes on to have implications for the information disclosed. So perceived responsibility and accountability go hand in hand. Unless a business determines that it's actually responsible for something, it's unlikely to go on and report about it. It has to be within its perceived realm of responsibility before it's going to make any report to do with it. So this concept is how we can see how social and environmental reporting has changed over a period of time. And we look initially, businesses not seeing any of this as their responsibility, and they didn't report on it. Now, as they see it as their responsibility, they begin to report on it. Companies operating in developing countries who are potentially not operating in the standards that we would expect in Australia, pumping effluent into rivers, polluting the air with unpurified sorry about that, and we'll continue. So this is a good concept to help us understand how businesses have changed their view of their responsibilities and therefore how they now go on to report about them. So the accountability of businesses, the duty to provide an account or reckoning of those actions for which one is held responsible. So there's 2 responsibilities or duties: the responsibility to undertake certain actions and the responsibility to provide an account of those actions. So traditionally, all this meant was making a profit. That was what a business had to do. That was their responsibility, the actions they had to undertake, and providing an account of those actions was providing an audited profit and loss statement. But to whom is business responsible? Many organisations make public statements that responsibilities extend beyond their shareholders to encompass communities in which they operate and society as a whole. So sustainability is embraced and responsibility is also owed to future generations. We'll remember back to that Brundtland definition of sustainability. So what are the 2 alternate views of business responsibility? And you can see them going head to head here. On the left, we've got business's sole responsibility is to make a profit within the confines of the law, or business has a corporate and social responsibility that should coexist with the profit-making objective. So the first view, one often espoused by the famous economist Milton Friedman, who said there's one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits as long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. Now, the financial media also often hold this view and applaud profitable organisations, and you can see that. They'll have an announcement, ANZ have made this magnificent profit, and simultaneously they announce that 700 jobs are being sent to some offshore country for processing. the social responsibility being ignored potentially in favour of the profit objective. The alternative view, organisations earn their right to operate in the community. They're artificial entities that society chooses to create, and organisations do not have an inherent right to resources. Their right to resources is derived from benefit that the company provides to the community. This issue of right to resources is quite interesting because you see that the companies who tend to report more on environmental issues, particularly, are the ones that are using resources, natural resources. Now, as much as we have schemes of royalties, mining rights, and all of this, I think there is a perception that those things that come from the earth are owned by all of us. All humanity has some right to them. So if a company is to exploit or excess or use those resources to an excess, then potentially the community is going to step in and have some objection to that. Companies are consequently accountable to society for how they operate, and the societal expectations may exceed profitability. We might be asking more of these companies than just making a profit. This is an interesting quote from Bill Gates, who talked about creative capitalism. So this is a view sort of somewhere in between the two, that potentially companies can act in a socially responsible manner, not just in the way they operate, but in choosing the types of markets and the location of markets that they choose to service. So does the Friedman argument hold true? An interesting quote from Gray, 2005, that you'll find in your textbook. It is disturbing to discover that there is no direct evidence to support this precarious construction. The view relies for its empirical support on the generalized argument that, for example, we are all better off than we have ever been, that we're all getting better off all the time, and that this increase in well-being has coincided with the triumph of international capitalism. Such arguments are, at best, contestable. While for the many in the West this statement is a superficial veracity, it means it's true, it ignores the growing gap between rich and poor. And it certainly gives us food for thought, and this holds true. While for many of us in the West this statement is true, a superficial veracity, it's easily seen. You can see across generations in my own family and perhaps in yours that we have got richer than we ever have been before, have better lives than we have been before. But the growing gap between the richest in our society and the poorest, perhaps not so much in our society but in our world, the richest in our world and the poorest in our world is certainly far larger than it's ever been before. So if sustainability becomes a part of the expectation held by society, it must become a business goal. This ensures the ongoing survival and competitiveness of the business. So providing information about social and environmental performance increases the trust the community has in the organisation. And the view that corporate survival and prosperity is tied to community perceptions is being promoted publicly by a number of companies, including Westpac. So there are many limitations in traditional financial reporting. It focuses on the information needs of those involved in resource allocation decisions. And that's primarily, when we talk about resource allocation decisions, about capital investment, funds. The difficulty in quantifying cost tends to restrict the focus on social and environmental reporting. We're looking at pollution in a river. We can't really cost that, can we? Liabilities are discounted to present value, which tends to make future cleanup expenditures appear trivial. So you remember from earlier studies, net present value, and how you can discount an enormous sum, millions and millions of dollars, that are due in 25, 30, 40 years' time, down to its present value, very insignificant. The entity assumption used where the entity is treated as distinct from its owners and other stakeholders. So transactions not directly impacting on the entity ignored, which ignores externalities caused by the reporting entity. Expenses are defined to exclude the recognition of any impacts on resources not controlled by the entity. And if they cannot be reliably measured, they're not recognised. Also tied into the whole issue of social and environmental reporting is how we report on the performance of governments. So it's reported to the outputs of the systems of national accounts. So we've got our GDP, a figure we'd all be familiar with, which doesn't consider issues of resource efficiencies or equities with how resources are distributed. So experiments are taking place to green the GDP, to actually incorporate some of these issues in the GDP. Japan, you may have heard, has gross national happiness. Their grounding in Buddhist ideals suggests that beneficial development of human society takes place when material and spiritual development occur side by side to complement and reinforce one another. They've got 4 pillars, and we can think back to our three-sided triangle, talking about social and environmental accounting. So the promotion of sustainable development, preservation and promotion of cultural values, conservation of the natural environment, and the establishment of good governance. So here we are on the theories. Legitimacy theory and social contract can describe social and environmental reporting. Stakeholder theory is the second one, and it's got a moral and a managerial perspective. There's an accountability model, institutional theory model, and a positive accounting theory model. So these are terms that you might be familiar with from some of the other topics, especially positive accounting theory. These are the 5 theories which explain social and environmental disclosure. And I'll go on and explain those in a little bit more depth. Legitimacy theory and social contract is something that's really important to study if you're looking at doing well this year. So it's based on political economic theory. Society, politics, and economics are inseparable, and therefore economic and accounting issues cannot be examined without examining the political, social, and institutional framework in which the activity takes place. Legitimacy theory asserts organisations will continue to operate within the bounds of society and will operate to ensure that their activities are seen as legitimate by society. So the society allows a company to operate so long as it adheres to the norms and values of that society. Management will adopt reporting strategies to demonstrate that it is legitimate. And the organisation must consider the public at large, not just investors. So it's the influence of the public at large that the organisation has to look legitimate to. If an organisation does not operate legitimately, then society will revoke the social contract. And we've heard a lot about Anderson's after Enron and so on, but one example a little bit closer to home is the AWB single desk. Now you might remember, perhaps 6 or 7 years ago, earlier than that, the AWB had a single export licence to export wheat from Australia, but it was discovered that they were exporting wheat into Iraq, and the terms of operation in Iraq are potentially considered to pay bribes. If you want to sell your wheat to Iraq, you've got to pay the right people, the right money in the right places to actually get that wheat in there. Now, that was found out. It was considered unacceptable by the Australian public, and it contributed significantly to them losing their single desk exporting rights. So what happened there? There was a social contract. They were perceived to have breached the social contract and then lost their legitimacy. There's a link here, and I'll put it up on the Interact, and it's a gentleman from Nestle, their CEO, talking about the social contract that Nestle have, and he's quite explicit there. It's the social contract's not a written contract. It's not something you'll ever see written down. This is our contract with society. But many companies are beginning to actually explicitly mention their social contract and acknowledge it. And Nestle is one of those companies that talks about that. The interesting point that he makes also is that he considers that organisations, that businesses are the best place to address these social and environmental issues. Why? Because they have a longer term of operation. A longer term of operation than any government would. Their decisions are longer lasting and longer reaching. And if you look at our, Western governments with our terms of 3 and 4 years, if you look at our 5 prime ministers in 5 years in Australia, you'll probably agree with him in acknowledging that companies like Nestle and other multinational companies are probably looking at things on a far longer time frame than perhaps our governments are at the moment. Nestle don't always come up smelling like roses, do they? In this case, they ended up coming smelling like cat food. What was discovered quite recently? Poor flavour in the cat food supply chain. So companies have to control what they're doing, but often in a modern multinational environment, it's suppliers that many companies have lots and lots of suppliers that are potentially out of their control, out of their influence. But Nestle were actually buying fish from Thailand, which were potentially, or it had been claimed, that made in Thailand from fish that had been caught by men and boys trafficked from poor and neighbouring countries and forced to work punishing hours while motivated by fear. Now, what's happening now? There is a lawsuit against them in California, and they're coming under great scrutiny because of that. Another example of legitimacy theory, a company that potentially broke their social contract. BP 2006 was responsible for a large oil spill. Their CEO initially called the amount of oil relatively tiny compared to the very big ocean. And later he drew an outpouring of criticism when he said that the spill was a disruption to Gulf Coast residents and himself, adding, I'd like my life back. Considering, I think there were quite a few people that died, or at least 2 or 3 people that died in that situation. It was quite insensitive. Now, in June of that same year, BP launched a PR campaign and successfully bid for several search terms related to the spill on Google and other search engines. So the first sponsored search result linked directly to the company's website. They were seeing their legitimacy was greatly at threat. And what happened? In July 2010, the CEO, Tony Hayward, lost his job. And who did they replace him with? An American citizen. Interesting for the British company, and also interesting because the Gulf Coast residents, it was the Gulf Coast of America, the ones that were potentially worst affected by the oil spill. Another interesting example, the Shenhua coal mine, facing legal challenge over risk to koala population. Now, if you've got some time, have a read of this article. Just pause the recording and have a bit of a read about the Chinese-based Shenhua mining company and the plans that they've got in the Liverpool Plains of New South Wales. And they talk about and the article talks about the company's lack of legitimacy from a global sense because of their activities in China. So stakeholder theory comes from 2 perspectives, the moral perspective and the managerial perspective. So the moral perspective, all stakeholders have an intrinsic right to be treated fairly by an organisation. Issues of power of stakeholders not directly relevant. Demand from a specific stakeholder should not be an issue. Management should manage for the benefit of all stakeholders. And the reporting aim is to account for actions and is driven by responsibility for actions rather than demand for stakeholders. So they're doing the right things for the right reasons. The stakeholder theory from the managerial perspectives considers the different stakeholders and how they can be managed to ensure organisational survival. It differentiates between stakeholders who the firm cannot operate without and the others. The expectations of powerful stakeholders will affect the operating and disclosure policies of the organisation. And the level of power of stakeholders increases, then the need to meet stakeholder demands increases. So this is doing the right things because you have to. So what plays out in reality? Firms consider both the organisational centred perspective and the accountability perspective. They will want to be seen to behave in an ethically responsible manner and also to manage the firm to ensure its continuing survival. For the accountability model, it essentially has a great deal of overlap with the moral branch of stakeholder theory. Organisations have many responsibilities, some of which are codified in law, and stakeholders have a set of rights, including the right to information. The institutional theory, this is basically organisations copying each other. Managers will develop and adopt new practices essentially if others are doing it. They fear if they don't emulate other organisations, they will risk disapproval from some of their economically powerful stakeholders. Positive accounting theory. So this one directly aligns with positive accounting theory, which you studied earlier, not PAT, capital letters, but positive accounting theory as a concept. All firms are driven by self-interest. If it involves a lower cost of capital and a higher share price, they will do it. Large firms rather than small firms are more likely to use voluntary social and environmental disclosure. Size is a proxy variable for political attention. What does that mean? If you're big, people look at you. Okay? If you're a big organisation, a big company, you're likely to get a lot of political attention. Reduction of reported income is hypothesised to reduce the possibility that people will argue that the organisation is exploiting other parties. So if your business is making a whole lot of money, it looks like you must be exploiting someone, exploiting the local people and not paying them enough money, exploiting the environment and not doing enough to protect it. Companies are also more likely to employ social responsibility campaigns and be more active in lobbying government if they are larger. So, what are firms doing? Efficiency reporting. This is looking at maximising the use of a given quantity of resources and minimising the environmental implications of using the resources, so related to environmental protection. And they might be looking at particular industry-based types of extraction rates, etc. It's the focus of many standalone environmental reports, and they don't address whether the goods being produced should be produced. And there's an example there about water. Rice being produced in Australia or the production of fossil fuels, and that's certainly one that's come up with this Shenhua mine, the coal mine, and also the Adani coal mine, the Indian company that are looking to start up their mine close to the Great Barrier Reef. Eco-justice reporting or social accounting, and that indicates how the entity is using its limited resources to ensure that disadvantaged groups are not forgotten. It includes information about creation of employment, education, healthcare, observance of human rights, equal opportunities, impact on Indigenous peoples, and support for people with disabilities, developing countries, etc. Environmental reporting, currently at eco-efficiency focus. It's led by the mining industry in Australia. Why? Obviously, big dirty industry, or the perception that it's a big dirty industry. The Australian Minerals Industry Code for Environmental Management. You remember back to our regulation topic where we talked about industries that were under particular political scrutiny often chose to become self-regulated as a way of avoiding government regulation. And that's where you can see these industries developing their code for environmental management, etc. The other one referred to down the bottom here, I talked about the New Britain Palm Oil Limited company that you might want to look up their sustainability report. That company, along with a number of other companies, in about 2006, developed a certification framework, a roundtable on sustainable palm oil. A number of industry bodies, a number of industry players got together, formed an industry body, called it the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, developed a certification framework so that a number of leading industry members could basically highlight their legitimacy, highlight their compliance, give themselves a framework for reporting on a number of different issues that were relevant specifically to that industry. What was one of their major reasons? The palm oil industry were under a lot of public scrutiny. This was a way of delivering legitimacy and a way of ensuring access to particularly lucrative European markets. Not an issue for palm oil that's going straight to China, straight to India, and even to Australia. But if you want to get palm oil into Europe, you have to have this certification. Social accounting addresses eco-justice issues, refers to consideration of social-based issues for external reporting purposes, used to evaluate how well a firm is fulfilling its social contract, acknowledges that the organisation has many stakeholders, with the stakeholders' expectations often driving the reporting process. Social disclosures are commonly made in annual reports, and that commenced from about the late 1990s. So what sorts of things are disclosed? Health and safety initiatives, injury rates, training programs, relationships with Indigenous peoples, community support programs. They're all typically ad hoc and inconsistent from year to year. So this leads us to just back here for a second. The ad hoc nature and the inconsistency from year to year is often a criticism of reporting. What do we talk about with our financial reports that we want them to be? Comparable, consistent, materiality is an issue. All of those things are very difficult to build into a social environmental reporting framework if you're just deciding to go it on your own. What has this led to? Global Reporting Initiative. It's a generally accepted framework for reporting on an organisation's economic, environmental and social performance. The criticism is that it can let companies partially off the hook. A company can be compliant whilst looking at the least impactful aspect of their business. For example, McDonald's only gives agriculture a brief mention, and it certainly has been criticised in many countries for being responsible for deforestation of quite large areas. It is quite successful and quite well taken up. 78% of companies worldwide refer to the GRI reporting guidelines, and of the world's 250 largest companies, the rate is 82%. Now, if you're up with your international accounting, interesting. The GRI initiative has a broader spread in terms of its consistent application across the world than IFRS. Why would that be? Social auditing. The purpose of social auditing is for an organisation to assess its performance in relation to society's requirements and expectations, and the results form the basis of an entity's publicly released social accounts. So the Body Shop has its social impact report. Social accounting standards, they were released in 1988 by the Council on Economic Priorities, and in 1999 ISEA launched the standard AA 1000, which was concerned with the process of setting up and operating social and ethical accounting and auditing systems. Power of the media. Interesting. Think back to the Nestle thing we were talking about earlier. The media can provide information about international operations, and organisations need to consider the international community, not just the local community. Negative media coverage is expected to impact on public perceptions of the legitimacy of the organisation. The social contract may now include values and norms of international groups. And you would have heard about PETA and the Australian wool industry and the live export markets to Indonesia. Strategic alliances with stakeholder groups. Many organisations enter strategic alliances with partnerships with other organisations, and they may have previously been adversaries. For example, the timber industry are linked with the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the Marine Stewardship Council and commercial fishing, Greenpeace and the Sydney Olympics bid. If you walk into your supermarket, you'll see RSPCA endorsing a number of different animal products. So, many organisations enter strategic alliances. What I want to say there, capture theory. Does that link back to capture theory? Have those businesses or those industries managed to capture the organisations which previously were particularly critical of them? So just to recap there, understanding the role of theory in social environmental accounting research and be aware of the various perspectives about the responsibilities of business. Are they there to make a profit or to adhere to a broader social contract? Be aware of various theoretical perspectives that can be applied to explain why organisations might voluntarily elect to provide information about their social environmental performance, and be aware of some recent initiatives in the areas of social environmental accounting. Identify some of the limitations of traditional financial accounting in relation to enabling users of reports to assess the reporting entity's social environmental performance. Environmental costs are difficult to measure. Have a think about whether businesses would want compulsory social environmental accounting regulations. have a think about how you'd answer a question about why a business might choose to provide this information and what information it might choose to provide. The important things to remember are access to markets, access to capital, and their legitimacy, and how those three things link in. Also looking at the short-term perspective of business versus the long-term perspective of business. Whilst in the short term, many of these things can be ignored by a business, in the long term, can a business survive? Can it continue to be profitable? Can it continue to be accepted by society if it breaches its social and environmental responsibilities or fails to take them seriously? Okay, I think that's enough for now. If you've stuck with me that long, good luck with the rest of your studies.